Hey everybody, Stephen Clyde here. We've covered Afghanistan, we've covered Iraq, we've covered Syria. So today we're going to be covering Yemen with our good friend Kyle Anzalone again, and he's going to be with us the next 2 days to finish out the week. Hope you guys enjoy it. The Peace and Liberty Podcast, episode 19. All right, Kyle, glad to have you back on, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me again, Stephen. How's it going?
It's going good. We've had really successful past 3 days. People have given great feedback, especially on that first episode we put out Monday. So we talked about Afghanistan, we talked about Iraq, and yesterday me and Will talked about Syria. So today me and you are going to talk about Yemen, and I'll just start off by saying I would not be able to point out Yemen on a map, and I think I'm not embarrassed because I think for most people they wouldn't either. So I guess you're going to start off to show us the map and show us some things, and yeah, we'll get it going.
Right. So start off with the map because that seems to be, what makes the most sense. So right here, if you look at the map, Yemen is located on the southeast corner of the Arabian Peninsula. It shares a border with Saudi Arabia and Oman. And another interesting kind of important strategic position of Yemen is it occupies this strait that connects the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea to the and the Indian Ocean to the Red Sea and then to the Mediterranean. And so if you're shipping something from, let's say, India into Europe, this would be one of the most efficient ways to go. Also moving things up around Africa and stuff like that. So just to zoom in right here, and I just want to show how close Yemen is to Djibouti. This is the continent of Africa, and then this is Yemen. And so, it's a very, there's a lot of important traffic that goes through these shipping lanes right here. And Yemen is the poorest country in the Middle East, even though it sits on this spot, which should really, be a point where they could maybe gain some wealth and stuff. But man, they import a ton of their food prior to the war. I believe they imported around 90% of their staple foods, and so things in Yemen have not been good with the work conditions.
And who controls Yemen?
So that's very complicated. So if you look at the map here, for those of you who aren't looking at the map, I'll try to use directions. Yemen's kind of shaped like an awkward rectangle. There's some squiggles and stuff, but more or less a rectangle. So in the northeast corner of that rectangle, you have the Houthis, who control from the border with Saudi Arabia all the way pretty close. Now, actually, they've taken almost all the way down to the south of that country. However, the Saudi-backed government whose official leader is President Hadi continues to control the key cities in South Yemen. And then Al-Qaeda and ISIS control a significant portion of territory in the more rural areas of Yemen. However, at one point in the time, they did control a key oil port. I think it's this one right here, Al-Mukaila. But they no longer control that, and I think that's under pretty much UAE control at this point. The second capital city of Yemen, this capital city of southern Yemen, Aden, was actually taken by a group of southern separatists from the Saudi-backed Hadi government. So 4 different groups controlling territory in Yemen.
Wow, yeah, that's really complicated. So I guess maybe you could just start off by giving us an overview of what we're going to talk about today. When did I think most people know what drone strikes are. And when we're talking about Yemen, we're talking more along the lines of drone strikes. And you were talking in your episode, I'm going to link to it, on your Foreign Policy Focus, episode 159, you kind of do like a Yemen cheat sheet episode. And you talk about how our politicians like Obama, we knew about Obama's kill list. And there was that one situation where he killed that one American guy, and even if he was a terrorist or not, just the circumstances were a bit odd. Maybe you could just touch on like how we found ourselves to like be involved with Yemen like we are today.
So there's 3 separate wars going on in Yemen, and the United States is fighting in 2 of them. One of those wars the United States is fighting in is a drone war that the United States claimed is authorized by the 2001 Authorization of Use of Military Force, and is fought against the jihadist groups Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and the Islamic State affiliate in Yemen. Something important to note here is that unlike in Syria and Afghanistan, where the ISIS aren't allied with the other Sunni groups. In this case, ISIS is allied with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. AQAP is known as one of, if not the most dangerous terrorist cell in the world. They're known as a group that plots attacks to come to America, and more 9/11 style attacks, where you have ISIS that will maybe call on, the Baghdadi will put out a podcast saying that jihadists of America, rise up and go shoot up your local church or whatever the hell. AQAP will actually plan to try to put operatives in the U.S., have those operatives gain some sort of weapons, and then use those weapons in a coordinated way. So these attacks, if they're successful, could cause catastrophic damage like you saw with 9/11. Whereas, while I guess the ISIS attacks have been successful in a lot of very disturbing ways for what they're trying to accomplish, it's not quite as coordinated. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, definitely. So would you say like 2011, after September 11th, let's start there. When did we start seeing the drone attacks that started to hit Yemen? Was that actually much later, or is 2011 around where we start our story here?
So I think actually 2002 is when Bush started the drone program in Yemen. The Bush drone program was shrouded in a lot more secrecy than the Obama program. So in somewhat typical government fashion, the one administration will do it covertly, and then the next administration will do it overtly, right? So for Bush, it was somewhat secretive. I don't think he carried out many drone strikes in Yemen. I don't think that President Bush really embraced the use of drone technology all that much. Just in general, especially as compared to Obama, even though he did use it. Other parts of the United States strategy during the Bush administration was the president of Yemen at the time, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who most people just call Salah, was brought into really the U.S. orbit, had several high-level meetings with U.S. officials, including Condoleezza Rice and George W. Bush. And they were, sold American weapons and given American weapons and training, etc., as part of counterterrorism missions.
And this is important because when did Salah come in?
What was that?
Well, what year did Salah come in? Because I think
he was the only president of Yemen ever up until 2012. So prior to 1990, Yemen was actually divided into North and South Yemen. North Yemen more or less resembled the territory that the Houthis control today. And South Yemen was actually in the Soviet orbit, and there are still communist, sympathizers or people who want communist government within Yemen. But Saleh became president, more or less dictator, when he united the country. At some point in there, he started having elections to, I guess, as like a ceremony for his rule. But it wasn't a real kind of thing. And then in 2011, when the Arab Spring came to Yemen, of course, this is a revolution across the Middle East, and saw the fall of dictators in Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, and Yemen. And so Saleh was forced to resign at that time. And that's when Hadi was appointed president. And then Hillary Clinton helped arrange a one-man election in which Hadi won in 2012. And the U.S. endorsed and sanctioned the election in the international community, even though he was only name on the ballot.
I don't know if this is forcing us to skip too far ahead, but Salah was actually killed this last December. I don't know if that's better to leave off for later, but what happened with that?
Yeah, let's definitely get to that later and finish up this drone piece first.
Great.
During the Obama years in the drone war and what you referenced, Obama, is kind of known as the drone president. And I think this is a very fitting title. Not only did he do atrocious things with the U.S. drone program, but amidst to carrying out over 500 strikes, I forget what the civilian numbers that Obama admits to, but they're pretty low. And it's hard to know exactly how many strikes they did carry out because a lot of them are shrouded in so much classification and secrecy, and they just don't admit to it. But over 500 total, and this is between Yemen, Pakistan, Libya, etc. Some of those Obama policies I just want to touch on were the signature strikes, which meant that they would carry out a strike on a target wait 10 to 15 minutes and hit that again. So what happens in the first 10 to 15 minutes after an explosion? Family members, first responders, passersby, good Samaritans rush to the scene and attempt to dig out bodies and make sure that, because it's not unlikely that one of these drone strikes blows up a school or something like that. And so people are rushing to the scene, trying to help out, and then another drone strike comes in, and all those people end up dead too. And so that was a long time policy. I think the Obama administration kind of said they weren't doing that near the end of his term. But I just read a story that came out a few weeks ago where the Trump administration, of course, authorized a drone strike that killed a 13-year-old boy in rural Yemen. In that drone strike, his 19-year-old cousin was pretty badly wounded. And I guess when first responders first came on the scene, they were very nervous about approaching him and, rushing to save this, kid who's bleeding his life because they were afraid that they would be hit by another strike. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I just said, wow. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Another Obama policy in Yemen that was, again, they said it was revised near the end of Obama's term, but I really don't think it effectively was. And that is they treated anybody killed in a drone strike that was a fighting age male, so probably 15 and up, as somebody who was a militant. And therefore, their death didn't matter, right? They would count them.
This is skewing the civilian death numbers.
Well, not only is it skewing the civilian death numbers, but it's justifying the slaughter of Yemen's young men, right? Yeah. I read a story. This was about Afghanistan, but similar policy. And that is, if you're in Afghanistan, you're like a field worker, and you're maybe taking a smoke break with your buddies and eating lunch or whatever. And if a drone or a plane flies over, everybody scatters because a group of 5 guys standing together looks too suspicious and worthy of an airstrike. And so, I just want to show through some of this the psychological conditionings that these policies have on the people. First responders not rushing to the aid of a wounded and dying man, men scattering roaches when our planes fly overhead. Is this who we want to be? Right?
Oh, I don't think people can even fathom that. I mean, we're so used to our fairly peaceful lives in the US that we don't even have to think about this stuff. And it's pretty easy to justify if you think you're at war with these people and you don't think anything you do to them causes their anger. It's pretty delusional, but this is what most people are fed and what most people are fed to believe.
Right. And whenever they talk about these weapons or about the missions themselves, they will call them surgical strikes, signature strikes, precision strikes, targeted strikes. So everybody's just like, oh, well, they're just killing the bad guys. Of course, sometimes the surgical strike blows up a school. So then what? And also, just to add to that, for the people on the ground, remember what we call these weapons, right? These are Predator drones that are firing Hellfire missiles. How does that feel when you're on the receiving side of that? I mean, on the American side, I guess you'd be like, oh, that sounds real cool. But man, it seems so terrible and cynical to the people on the ground, I'm sure.
And it's just totally perpetual because, me and Will are talking about yesterday, and I think we talked about this the other day, that a lot of these terrorists, they're usually educated, middle class, and they know what they're doing. And they probably had someone in their family that died in one of these attacks.
Right. Or, they witnessed the results of the attacks or anything. I mean, imagine coming upon an attack where 3 children were blown apart by a bomb. You know what? Let's just go on to the next one real quick. We have the targeted drone program of Barack Obama. And this was where he put together kill lists, judge, jury, and executioner, and conducted targeted drone strikes against an American civilian, Anwar al-Awlaki, who didn't pose an imminent threat to the United States. I guess in some ways you could argue that he was an enemy combatant to America, maybe, as he was a member of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and was a terrorist. However, he wasn't, actively going to kill Americans or anything like that. But Obama had him drone bombed. And then a couple weeks later, so this is important to remember, father's already dead, another Obama drone strike kills his 16-year-old son, who's also an American citizen. I postponed the other thing because the story goes that this young man was only identified after they found a clump of skull and hair that resembled his. And so imagine what it must be like for these family members who have to go through and look at their children's body parts to try to determine if they were dead. I
And
can't
sad.
imagine how
Yeah.
horrifying that would be.
Oh, just absolutely. I'm just fast forwarding a little bit, and we're referring back to your foreign policy focus episode 159. You referred to a Bloomberg article, and this article is pretty great. And your point of discussing the article wasn't to agree with everything, but just to notice that it did point out a lot of things we can talk about, we can agree or disagree. One thing it talks about, one section, is how bad has it gone for civilians. It says the death toll from fighting so far is estimated at 10,000 compared to 470,000 that died in the 7 years of the civil war in Syria. So has it gotten worse, or was this article actually pretty recent? I didn't look at the date.
So the article was pretty recent, but anybody who's actually an A worker in Yemen could tell you they have no idea how many people have died from the conflict in the war. And that also doesn't include the numbers of the drone war numbers. That would just be from the Yemen civil war, probably 2015 and on, since Saudi got involved. I believe is where they get that statistic. So something we'll get into a little bit more with the humanitarian crisis, but in Yemen, a lot of hospitals, roads, and bridges have been destroyed, and they're only counting the fatality numbers from people who are actually able to make it to the hospital. So if you live somewhat in rural Yemen and they destroy the bridge that gets you to the nearest hospital, it could be 10 hours. I think, as Will Porter lays out in his article, we should get this and link to it in the show notes page for people to read. But anyways, in that article, he lays out how 2-hour trip to the hospital suddenly turns into a 10-hour trip to the hospital when they blow up the roads and bridges. But oh yeah, there's not enough fuel in the country, so then it's going to take you like 20 hours to get there. And so if you don't get to that hospital and you die, then they don't count your death in those official tolls. And so the number's a lot higher. Yemeni journalist Nasser Arabi, who lives in Sana'a, Yemen, and I guess I should qualify by saying he is somebody who definitely has a bias towards the Houthis over the Saudi coalition, says that 60 to 70,000 people, by his counts, that he's been able to document, have died in the war.
So I'm looking at the map here, and it looks like, and maybe we should distinguish this for the viewers real quick. There's the Houthis, which are backed by Iran, and then there are the, let's see here what I write down here.
All right, can we hold on that real quick and just finish up the drone thing real quick?
Yeah, go for it.
This makes sense because we could stay on the topic of Anwar al-Awlaki. Trump takes office in 2017, and al-Awlaki's 8-year-old daughter is visiting her grandmother in rural Yemen, and Trump orders a raid on that village that she's staying in. There wasn't any Al-Qaeda in the village, and in fact, when the U.S. Army troops approached the village, the people within the village thought that it was the Houthis coming for them, who, as we'll get into in a second, the United States is actually fighting a war against in Yemen. So they thought these were American enemies coming over the hill, but when they're really Americans, they get into a shooting fight. And 8-year-old little American girl gets a bullet through the neck and bleeds out in her grandmother's arms. Wow. So that's absolutely horrifying. Like I said before, the 13-year-old boy dying pretty recently. These drone strikes continue under Trump, just like they did under Obama. I don't know. Everybody likes to catastrophize Trump and idolize Obama and pretend like, oh, this was a great man, and how he said, like, Trayvon Martin could have been my son, but Anwar al-Awlaki's 8-year-old girl could never have been Sasha, right?
Right.
And so that's he's not that great, right? Because as long as the kids are being killed far enough away, he doesn't care apparently.
What was the numbers under Obama? He dropped the bomb. It was like every 20 minutes, all 8 years, something like that.
And the only number I could think of off the top of my head is he dropped 26,000 bombs in 2016 alone. So I don't know what the totals are. That, like, it's over 100,000 over the total of his 8 years in office. I mean, in 2016, he dropped 500 bombs on Libya alone. So he was definitely racking them up. And of course, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and the rest of them were cashing in the whole time. The only other thing I can mention on the drone war, and then we can move on to the main civil war, is that the United States is currently working with both the UAE and Saudi Arabia in carrying out anti-terror missions, or at least this is what the U.S. government is saying. And one of the reasons this is significant is the United States is also helping Saudi Arabia and UAE fight a war against the Houthis. And so I think there's some often conflation going on. The United States is maybe masking how much they're assisting the fight against the Houthis by saying that they're counterterrorism missions.
Gotcha.
I think that's all I have on the drone war. Oh, other than that, I think there's reason to question whether the 2001 AUMF would apply to AQAP, just because Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula wasn't even formed until 2006. And so we're waging a war against the people in Yemen, which isn't anywhere near Afghanistan. I could zoom back out on my map real quick and point to Afghanistan for everyone, just so you can see how far away these two countries are. But the point being is that they're using this authorization to justify this war, and we're supposed to be a constitutional republic, yet we don't even have the pretense of Congress voting on anything like this.
All right, so this has been really good information thus far, but I guess start us off. Yeah, how did we get into the Civil War?
Yeah, so I guess the big war in Yemen is the Yemeni Civil War, and this kind of all got rolling in 2011, as I explained, with the Arab Spring, and then the transition of power from Salah to Hadi. And then you had a situation where former President Salah had some of the army units, a good portion of Yemen's army was still loyal to him. Yemen isn't the United States, where if you have an election, the whole army moves to the next person elected. I mean, as I said before, Salah was the only leader of United Yemen ever, so a lot of people just went with him. And it turns out that Salah is a Zaidi and went to the north where the Houthis were, who are also, the Houthis are a political and religious movement of Zaidi Shia that is some more or less Shia. But it's a Shia that's very close to Sunni Islam.
And sorry for the simple question. What is the difference between Shiite and Shia?
I don't think there is one. I think people just say differently.
I didn't think there was either. I just
hopefully I'm not completely wrong about that. I just stuck my foot in my mouth. But yeah, I've heard people use it interchangeably, so I always have as well.
Okay, great.
So anyways, the Zaydis are Shia that are close to the Sunnis. They team up with Salah, who is also a Zaydi, and they are able to go from the north of Yemen, which is the Zaydi kind of territorial lands, and take territory all the way to the south of Yemen to Sana'a. At that point, they surround the capital city, and Hadi is forced to flee to South Yemen and all the way down here to Aden. Now, at this time, the Iranians told the Houthis not to take the capital city. They said, don't go in and sack the capital city. Just be happy with the territory you have. But they went and touched Sana'a anyways. And then they chased Hadi all the way down south to Aden and were actually threatening Aden. And this is in 2014. And Hadi fled to Saudi Arabia, where he currently is this day, living in the capital city of Riyadh. Then on March 25th, 2015, and I think this is maybe the date's the 26th. Some people say differently. Either way, Saudi Arabia starts bombing the Houthis in order to try to restore Hadi as the leader of Yemen. And that's really where the civil war gets kicked off. I guess the first and most important thing to say is, why do I keep saying that this is a U.S. war if Saudi Arabia is the one doing the bombing? And that's because the United States is providing the weapons to Saudi Arabia to allow them to do this bombing. They're providing Saudi Arabia with mid-air refueling, so their jets are able to fly and hover over the cities of northern Yemen for hours at a time, carry out more airstrikes, and provide different amounts of troop coverage or whatever, provide ground support, and are able to carry out a much more effective air war against the Houthis because the United States is providing mid-air refueling. We're also providing maintenance on their airplanes because Saudi Arabia apparently can't maintain their own airplanes. And we're also providing intelligence, targeting help, and logistical help in waging this air campaign.
And you were talking about how things are so bad right now. Like half the hospitals are just gone.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All right, so that yeah, this is the humanitarian crisis of Yemen, and pretty quickly after the war gets going, the international aid organizations start sounding the alarm, and they're saying this is going to get really ugly, and we need to do something about this because, like I said, Yemen imports about 90% of its staple foods prior to the war. Yemen isn't a country that produces a whole lot of oil or anything like that, and it's really an impoverished country already leading up to the war. Of course, Salah, when he was president of Yemen, actually fought several wars against the Houthis in the north, who it may seem confusing, but he then goes and later allies with. So the country's already devastated by war, right? And there's already bad conditions. Everybody's already poor, and then Saudi Arabia starts bombing the place. Pretty quickly, I think Salah and the Houthis lose all of their air power. And at this point, I'm pretty sure that they don't have any remaining air power whatsoever. And the humanitarian catastrophe gets underway. It's aided by Saudi Arabia's blockade of Yemen, particularly the territories of northern Yemen, a key port in Yemen that provides the imports for about 80% of the people. And 80% of the people do live in the Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen. Even if it looks like Saudi Arabia controls most of the country, they control a pretty small percentage of the actual population.
Yeah,
So
because that's what I was going to say. So just for the people viewing, that red portion on Yemen, that's the Houthi controlled area. But you're saying actually most of the population of all Yemen lives in that area.
Right, absolutely. So with that blockade, medical aid, journalists, food, fuel are unable to get into the country. They're preventing them from getting in. There's also an airport in the capital city of Sana'a, centralish, eastern Yemen there, or western Yemen, and that's also blocked off. And so now the Yemenis don't have any way to get medicine, to get food, to get fuel. And like I said, your 20-hour trip to the hospital is made a hell of a lot more expensive and sometimes impossible if you suddenly run out of fuel because either the prices are skyrocketing or because there's just none to be had in your area.
Now, I'm just assuming this, but it's like the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. There's just a ton of warships lined up all over there.
Right. So for a long time, I really couldn't tell if the United States was directly aiding the Saudi blockade of Yemen. It seems likely to me that they would have to because Saudi Arabia doesn't have a brand new navy or anything like that. It's pretty old, and there's not a whole lot of ships. I do think they're at least have made some interest in purchasing some new ships. But anyways, so for that reason, it seemed to me likely that the United States ships are out there enforcing the blockade. In 2016, the Houthis launched a couple ballistic missiles at U.S. ships that were out in the Red Sea, I believe. And so the evidence seems to be that the United States is helping Saudi Arabia enforce that blockade. And they say they enforce the rules of the waterways in that area. And if our ally Saudi Arabia are saying that it's illegal to bring food and fuel into the port of Hodeidah, then I guess that's the law that the United States is enforcing.
Wow, it just seems like an impossible situation. I mean, people are just starving.
Right. And to clarify, that blockade at most times is a commercial blockade, meaning that no commercial goods, even if it's flour, wheat, etc., can't get into the country, but they let humanitarian goods into the country. However, Saudi Arabia bombed the cranes at the port of Hodeidah. For years, I think until the early 2018, Saudi Arabia didn't allow the United States to bring in movable cranes that could be used at the port of Hodeidah to at least allow some offloading of ships at that port. They finally allowed those cranes in, but apparently the port's in such bad condition and the cranes are so small, they're not super effective. And Yahoo actually published a pretty good article recently saying that right now there's a de facto blockade of Hodeidah. In the past, Saudi Arabia has completely blockaded the port of Hodeidah and said that they weren't even letting international aid get in. So they were actually telling U.S. Red Cross ships to turn around and get the hell out.
I'm going to quote directly from that Bloomberg article. During the war, The Saudi-led coalition had disrupted food and other supplies coming into Yemen by imposing a naval blockade on ports in the Houthi-controlled north, notably Hudaida and Salif, through which about 80% of imports normally were 80% of imports normally enter the country. So yeah, that pretty much sums it up.
Right. And I guess the other thing to touch on is the bombing campaign and what the Saudis have hit in their bombing campaign, other than just the roads, bridges, and hospitals, because they've bombed factories. And one of the things that I guess Yemen produced was cereal, and they had cereal factories, but those have been destroyed, making it much more difficult for people to have jobs and stuff like that. You also have Saudi Arabia bombing schools, government facilities, their water treatment plants. And I guess this could get us into the discussion on the cholera epidemic that broke out last year.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just looking at this article again, and I noticed this one part. The US, UK, and Israel are among the nations that have imposed blockades during times of war. Under international humanitarian law, blockades are legal if they prevent arms and material from reaching enemy forces. But what you're saying is, more than likely, we're supplying Saudi Arabia with these same exact weapons.
Oh, well, we're supplying Saudi Arabia with much better weapons than anything that the Houthis have. I mean, the Saudis are flying F-15s, armed with laser-guided bombs and blowing up schools and huts in rural Yemen with them. I'm sure that the cost of the bomb is a lot more than anything most of those bombs end up destroying.
Jesus. Well, yeah, man, I guess we're getting to the end here, but finish it off. What's going on nowadays, or maybe if you have any other stories to give us?
Yeah, I guess the nowadays part. Well, can we address the arming of the Houthis by Iran?
Absolutely, man. Don't miss anything that I don't know about. Cover everything.
Okay, so this is the big one that has to be addressed, and this is always the excuse for the war, is that this is just a proxy war in the Middle East between between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Saudi Arabia backs the Yemeni government, Iran backs the Houthis. And this simply isn't true that Iran backs the Houthis. As I said, the Zaydis aren't Shia like the Iranians are. And really, it seems that the only thing that has driven the Houthis to even having sympathies with Iran is that they're both treated poorly by the Americans and by the Saudis. So anyways, there's all these reports that the Houthis are arming the Yemenis. And so I'm going to address the three most cited claims. The first is that there were two ships that were bringing the Houthis weapons from Iran in 2011 and 2013. In one of those cases, the ship was empty. It was an Iranian crew, but the ship was completely empty. In the second case, it seemed like the weapons were actually leaving Yemen and going to Somalia. And if I can move the map here real quick, you see that Yemen's pretty close to Somalia. And so it would make sense of this. Also, Yemen is one of the most armed countries in the world as far as it goes with small arms. I think maybe they're only third to the United States and Iraq in that case. Right. So imagine that maybe the Houthis are a little bit like Texans or something like that. And so it's not like they necessarily need Iran to ship them a bunch of AK-47s or anything like that. The other claims are made by Nikki Haley at the UN, saying that Iran is providing the Houthi with missiles. This simply isn't true. Weapons expert Scott Ritter explained that the Yemenis are firing a variation of Scud missiles that were sold to South Yemen by the Soviets and by the North Koreans in the 1980s, when North and South in Yemen were divided and it was Cold War times, and this is what was going on. So what the Houthis are doing is they're cutting up the missiles and they're converting them, and they're making them into Yemeni-designed ballistic missiles. And of course, the Houthis got these weapons through Saleh because when he became president, I'm guessing he just didn't leave his, all of his Scud missiles laying around, right? So he had the missiles.
And what happened with Salah? Because he died.
Right. So December 7th, maybe late November, early December of 2017, Saleh cuts the deal with the Saudis and stabs the Houthis in the back. And it looks like maybe there's actually a conclusion to the Yemen war here, because if everybody is okay with Saleh retaining power, then maybe we're able to move past this. Maybe he beats the Houthis back and everybody goes back to the way things were in 2010 or something like that. I don't know. But anyways, it turns out that the tribal fighters didn't take the side of Salah, and then the Houthis went and killed him, and they killed all of his relatives that would remain loyal to him. And then apparently, if you were a Salah supporter, some of them did go to the Hadi-backed government, but I think most of them just joined up the Houthi movement under the Houthis. And I think the Houthi movement in Yemen has taken on a little bit of an anti-Saudi coalition, just as much as that we agree with the Houthis. Does that make sense?
Yes, it totally does. I mean, it's just a whole big mess over there. So, I mean, you think even if the war ended, they still have these import problems? Like, they still got to get all these goods. And I don't know. It's just so much going on at once. Well, what would you ideally like to see happen? Because you know about everything that's going on.
So I guess the first thing is that you got to end the drone war. As we discussed before, it's just absolutely horrific on the Yemeni people. The second thing that you got to do is you got to end the support for Saudi's war against Yemen. This means that Saudi Arabia may be able to wage a little bit of a war against Yemen still. But as we've seen, Saudi Arabia is pretty unwilling to put any of their own troops actually in Yemen. And in fact, I think they have a bunch of Pakistanis guarding the border, because a few times, as you can see here, for those of you who are looking at the map, the Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen actually border Saudi Arabia. So the Yemenis at time have been able to cross the border and attack Saudi positions on the other side. And like I said, I think those are actually Pakistanis down there now guarding the border. Maybe something like 2,600 Pakistani troops are in Saudi Arabia. Where else was I going with this?
Oh man, we've covered so much here. I'm gonna link to Foreign Policy Focus episode 159. I'm gonna link to that Will Porter article you just mentioned a few minutes ago, where he talks about the crazy, insane, long trips you have to get to a hospital. Gonna link to live UA map. Can you think of anything else I can link to, Kyle?
I think that about does it. I have a little thing on immersionnews.com y'all could check out here. If you click on Yemen, you can see all the news stories I got here saved up on Yemen. So if you want to look back and do a little bit of reading, you can find that there.
All right, awesome. Well, we're actually going to have you back on tomorrow to finish out the week. Was it Libya we were going to discuss tomorrow?
Yeah, we could. Libya, I mean, there's a lot left. Libya, Pakistan, etc. But we could talk about whatever you want.
We could probably do Libya, half of it, and the other half, finish off just like an overview of like how this all connects. But man, it's been a really, really great week so far. So thanks a bunch, Kyle, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Hey everyone, please like, follow, donate, subscribe, and share. Any donations will be used to reach more people.